Between January and August of 1945, the war in the Pacific concentrated in a single objective, the final destination of the Japanese archipelago. For then, more than 7 million of tons of maritime transport had been sunk in a single year, the traffic of oil had reduced to critical figures and the essential imports were practically paralyzed. From the Marianas at 2,500 kilometers from Tokyo, hundreds of B-29 initiated incursions that in few months would raze more than 60 cities. Only in the night of the 9 to the 10 of March, the capital lost more than 40 square kilometers under a single incendiary attack. In Washington were being finalized the plans to invade the main islands. In Tokyo, the High Command tried to organize a defense every time more limited by the lack of fuel, transport and industrial capacity. The decisions in both sides of the Pacific already did not respond to political declarations, but to concrete figures, deciphered reports, and operative evaluations that accumulated week after week. In that crossroads of naval blockade, systematic bombing and planning of invasion went defining itself the outcome. How did produce itself really the devastating destruction of Japan? The invisible siege, the blockade that suffocated Japan. At the end of 1944, Japan continued fighting in multiple fronts, but the center of gravity of the war already was not in the distant islands nor in the large naval battles. The real problem was in the sea that surrounded the archipelago. Since months ago, US submarines patrolled the commercial routes and attacked with constancy the freighters and tankers that sustained the imperial economy. What at the beginning of the conflict had been a war of fleets had converted into a systematic campaign against the maritime transport. During the first years, the US naval doctrine had given priority to sink enemy warships. That mentality changed in 1944. The orders began to signal with clarity that the tankers and freighters should convert into principal objectives. For then, the technical problems of the torpedoes had been corrected, and the commanders less aggressive had been replaced. The result was immediate. In only that year, more than 600 Japanese ships were sent to the bottom of the sea, adding close to 27 million of tons. The monthly figures reflected the impact. In July were lost more than 200,000 tons. In August, the figure exceeded the 240,000. In September, again exceeded the 180,000. The subsequent descent did not indicate less pressure, but that remained fewer ships available to attack. Japan had initiated the war needing around 10 million of tons of maritime transport to sustain its economy. In 1941, barely counted with something more than 6 million under its flag. The initial conquests had added certain capacity but not sufficient. With the passing of the years, the imbalance became unsustainable. At beginnings of 1945, the available tonnage had reduced to little more than 2.5 million. Great part of the remaining merchant fleet was dispersed or damaged, and a considerable portion of the tankers remained immobilized without possibility of fulfilling their original function. The problem of the oil was central. Japan needed between 6 and 7 million of tons annual to maintain its war machinery. The internal production barely reached a minimum fraction of that quantity. The reserves of the Southeast Asian had been one of the strategic objectives that propelled the initial expansion. Those fields could produce sufficient volumes, but the true obstacle was to move the crude until the Japanese refineries and then distribute the fuels towards the fronts of combat. The transport was the bottleneck. Submarines and Allied planes attacked with special insistence the tankers. In December of 1944, a single submarine patrol achieved to destroy several tanker ships that transported 100,000 barrels each one. That month, barely a minimum part of the planned fuel arrived to Japanese territory. In March of 1945, no tanker achieved to complete the journey until the main islands. The accumulated effect was devastating. The interruption of the commerce not only affected the fuel, the imports of coal, iron ore, rubber and fertilizers fell in an abrupt way. In 1941, the figures were high. In 1944, they had reduced drastically. In 1945, they collapsed until levels almost symbolic. The factories that depended on external raw materials began to paralyze. The effort to disperse the industry, trying to protect it from aerial attacks, ended generating more disorganization than protection. To move machinery and personnel to improvised installations without sufficient infrastructure reduced the efficiency instead of increasing it. The labor force also suffered. After a decade of continuous war, the working population was exhausted. The workdays were long and the inflation had eroded the salaries. The scarcity of food forced many to abandon temporarily their posts to search for provisions. The posterior reports signaled that the fall in the industrial production during the spring of 1945 was abrupt. Between March and April, the manufacture of armament descended in a significant way, and in the following months continued lowering until reaching approximately the half of the maximum registered the previous autumn. To this economic deterioration added another form of pressure. At ends of 1944, the U.S. aerial bases in the Marianas began to operate with regularity. Saipan, Tinian and Guam had been secured after intense combats during the summer. From those islands, at some 1,500 kilometers from Honshu, the new B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese territory without necessity of intermediate stops. The 1 of November of 1944, one of these apparatuses overflew Tokyo in a mission of photographic reconnaissance. The population observed in silence the white trail in the sky. There were no bombs that day, only the confirmation that the enemy could arrive to the heart of the country. Shortly after began the first incursions with explosive load. The 24th of November, 100 of B-29 took off with the objective of attacking a factory of aeronautical engines to the north of the capital. The conditions in height surprised the crews. Winds of great speed, unknown until then by the strategic aviation, altered the precision of the bombings. Only a part of the planes achieved to impact in the predicted objective. Many projectiles fell in nearby industrial zones. That experience revealed technical difficulties that forced to revise tactics and procedures. Meanwhile, in the interior of the country, the Japanese High Command analyzed the situation. In the Imperial General Headquarters were discussed plans to reinforce the defense of the national territory. The losses in the Pacific had reduced the offensive capacity of the Navy. The attention centered in preparing the army and mobilizing resources within the main islands. Troops deployments, reorganization of units and utilization of existing infrastructures were studied. The emphasis was in conserving what remained and anticipating a direct confrontation on own soil. The submarine pressure complemented itself with the aerial mining of interior waters. Operations directed against key straits restricted even more the movement of ships. The Strait of Shimonoseki, vital point for the communication between interior seas and the exterior, remained practically blocked. The damaged ships had difficulties even to reach repair shipyards. The coastal traffic suffered constant delays. Goods that before moved by sea should be transported now by railroad, saturating a network already demanded to the maximum. At beginnings of 1945, the combined effect of the submarine blockade, the aerial mining and the first campaigns of bombing had created an almost total siege around the archipelago. The remaining merchant fleet avoided the long crossings for fear of shore losses. The commanders were conscious that each shipment could convert into a useless sacrifice. The Imperial Navy lacked sufficient escorts and its anti-submarine methods were limited. The result was a progressive isolation of the main islands with respect to the continental territories. The capacity of influencing in the course of the war from the sea reduced in a drastic way. The large surface ships barely could operate for lack of fuel. The priorities passed to center in the direct defense of the territory. The cities yet had not suffered the massive devastation that would arrive later, but the economic infrastructure already showed signs of exhaustion. The figures of import, production and transport reflected a continuous descent. In that context, the winter of 1940 and 4 to 1945 found Japan in a precarious situation. The country still disposed of significant armed forces and maintained positions in continental Asia, but the material base that sustained the war effort was eroding with speed. The decisions taken in the previous months, both by those who organized the blockade and by those who tried to resist it, had configured a scenario in which each ton of fuel, each shipment of raw materials, and each plane that took off from the Marianas formed part of a constant pressure. The siege did not express itself only in visible combats. It manifested in factories that reduced shifts, in trains loaded with scarce materials, in ships that remained anchored for lack of protection. From the exterior, submarines and bombers acted with increasing regularity. From the interior, military and civil authorities tried to reorganize limited resources to sustain the defense of the territory. The balance inclined slowly, while the country faced an isolation that affected both its industrial capacity and its daily life. The aerial war changes the turn of LeMay. When the bombers began to operate in a sustained way from the Marianas, the central idea continued being the same that had guided the aerial campaign in Europe: to attack key installations with precision to paralyze the Japanese military industry. That doctrine had been formulated years before and defended by officers who believed that destroying specific factories could break the combat capacity of a country without necessity of razing entire cities. In the Pacific, the responsible of applying that focus was the General Haywood Hansell, a convinced of the selective bombing. The first operations left clear that the theory faced enormous practical obstacles. The crews flew at great height to avoid anti-aerial defenses and enemy fighters, but in those superior layers of the atmosphere they found themselves with extremely fast wind currents that altered completely the trajectory of the bombs. At speeds close to the 130 or 140 miles per hour, those winds displaced the apparatuses and made that the projectiles fell far from the predicted objective. To that added persistent clouds that covered wide industrial zones, which forced to resort to the radar, a system that in that moment did not offer the necessary exactness to hit small targets with regularity. The figures of results did not satisfy Washington. Dozens of planes were sent and returned with dispersed impacts or limited damages. The losses by mechanical failures, adverse weather, and operative errors continued being high. The B-29 was an advanced apparatus, but still dragged technical problems: engines that overheated, electrical failures, and difficulties in long flights. The general performance did not correspond to the magnitude of the resources invested in the program. In the summer and autumn of 1940 already had produced itself an internal debate about the convenience of maintaining operations from Chinese bases. The necessary logistical effort to supply those aerodromes through the Himalayas consumed enormous quantities of fuel and time. Curtis LeMay, who had assumed the command of the 20 Bomber Command in that region, observed of first-hand how inefficient resulted that system. Each mission demanded multiple previous transport flights only to accumulate the necessary fuel. The operations, according to his own reports, could not sustain themselves in an effective way in those conditions. LeMay had fame of being a practical commander, focused in results. In Europe, he had demonstrated capacity to organize formations, improve procedures, and increase the efficacy of the attacks. His reputation grew rapidly, and he was promoted with speed. At ends of 1940 while the difficulties in the Marianas made themselves evident, in Washington began to form the idea that it was necessary a change of leadership. In January of 1945, the General Loris Norstad arrived to Guam with direct orders from General Henry Arnold. Hansell would be relieved from the command of the 21 Bomber Command and substituted by LeMay. The decision reflected a loss of confidence in the strategy applied until then. It did not treat solely of unsatisfactory numbers, but of the fear that the program of the B-29 remained discredited if it did not produce visible effects. LeMay took possession of the position at ends of January. He found a numerous force in men and planes, but with low morale and procedures that he considered inefficient. In his first reports, he described a little effective staff and units that, to his judgment, worked without a clear focus. He ordered an intensive program of training. He demanded greater discipline in the navigation, in the use of the radar, and in the coordination between crews. He increased the useful load per plane, eliminating part of the defensive armament that he considered unnecessary in front of a Japanese aerial opposition that he evaluated as limited. While he reorganized the force, he examined the results of previous months. The reports signaled that the attacks of precision at great altitude were not producing damages proportional to the effort invested. In December of 1940 an internal document already had admitted that the 20th Air Force was not capable of bombing with efficacy small objectives through radar. The meteorological forecasts indicated besides that the bad weather over the archipelago would persist during months. In those conditions, maintaining the same method promised similar results. In parallel, in Washington, and in diverse analysis committees was discussed openly the vulnerability of the Japanese cities to fire. Previous studies had signaled the high industrial concentration in densely populated urban zones, where workshops, warehouses and small factories were integrated in residential neighborhoods. Photographs, plans and even details of domestic construction were examined to evaluate how would react those environments before incendiary attacks. Tests realized in experimental installations confirmed the efficacy of new devices like the M69 bomb, equipped with a flammable gel that dispersed upon impacting and generated fires difficult to control. The orders began to reflect that change of focus. Although the official priority continued mentioning the destruction of the aeronautical industry, area attacks were authorized as part of the general effort. For LeMay, the question ceased to be theoretical. He needed to find a way of employing the force under his command of a way that produced tangible results. In February, he ordered several missions that combined explosives and incendiaries. He observed that at lower height the precision improved and the intense winds of the superior layers had less influence. Also, he confirmed that the Japanese defense, at least in certain zones, did not represent the obstacle that had been feared initially. The losses did not increase in a disproportionate way when flight profiles were modified. At beginnings of March, he wrote to Washington indicating that he was developing radical methods to employ the available force. The central idea consisted in abandoning the daytime bombing at great altitude as dominant formula and adopting nocturnal attacks at lower quota, concentrating great quantities of incendiaries over urban industrial areas. For that, it was necessary to adjust tactics, eliminate superfluous weight in the apparatuses, redefine formations, establish guide planes that marked the point of start and coordinate the waves to maximize the propagation of the fire. The change was not received with enthusiasm by all the crews. Flying by night at lower height and with less defensive armament generated disquiet. Some pilots feared that the decision increased unnecessary risks. However, LeMay insisted in that the available data showed a limited Japanese aerial threat and that the true inefficacy resided in the dispersion of impacts caused by the wind and the weather. The doctrinal transformation remained thus defined. In place of trying to neutralize individual installations with precise attacks that depended on ideal conditions, the objective would pass to be the wide destruction of zones where the industry was integrated in the urban fabric. The British experience in Europe offered a precedent. In the Pacific, the direction of the effort fell now in a commander willing to modify methods until obtaining the sought effect. At measure that plans were adjusted and incendiary bombs accumulated in the bases of the Marianas, the aerial war over Japan entered in a new phase. The combination of political pressure, technical limitations of the bombing of precision, and detailed analysis of the Japanese industrial structure had led to a strategic turn. The 21 Bomber Command, under its new command, prepared itself to apply a different focus, supported in a cold evaluation of previous results, and in the conviction that the campaign should intensify in a decisive way. Operation Meeting House, the night that Tokyo was set on fire. At beginnings of March of 1945, in the Mariana Islands, the 21 Bomber Command finished adjusting an operation that would mark a point of inflection within the aerial campaign against Japan. The evaluation of results of the previous months was clear. The dispersion provoked by the winds in height, together with the Japanese industrial fragmentation in thousands of workshops inserted in residential neighborhoods, made that the impact of the attacks of precision was limited. The new approach started from a different premise. If the Japanese industry was dispersed in light structures integrated in dense urban zones, then the most effective form of paralyzing it was to set on fire those complete zones. Tokyo was selected as principal objective, not by symbolism, but by productive concentration and constructive density. Wide areas of the east of the city were formed by dwellings and small workshops of wood and paper, with narrow streets that facilitated the propagation of the fire. The operational planning was designed with precision. The first planes that would take off would not transport the greatest explosive load, but marker bombs. Their function would be to delimit a rectangular area over which the rest of the force would concentrate the releases. A pattern of approximation was established in which each squadron would follow defined corridors, avoiding interferences in the nocturnal aerial traffic. To maximize the incendiary load, LeMay authorized to withdraw great part of the defensive armament of the B-29. The number of machine guns was reduced and unnecessary weight was eliminated. The decision implied a calculated risk. They would fly at lower altitude between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, within the potential reach of the anti-aerial artillery, but the experience indicated that the Japanese intercepting capacity was limited and the fuel scarce. The selected bombs were mainly M69, small incendiary cylinders loaded with napalm. Each container bomb released dozens of sub-munitions that, upon impacting, pierced light roofs and scattered a gelatinous substance that adhered to surfaces and continued burning even over wet materials. Also were included M40 and 7 bombs of greater size to initiate more intense initial focuses. The night of the 9th of March began with the staggered takeoff from Tinian, Saipan and Guam. More than 300 B-29 initiated the crossing over the Pacific. The route traced took them towards the northwest, ascending initially to secure altitude and then descending progressively before reaching the Kanto Plain. The nocturnal flight reduced the Japanese defensive precision and facilitated the relative surprise. In Tokyo, the sirens began to sound shortly after the midnight. The population was accustomed to frequent alerts, although many previous incursions had not produced devastating damages. Local brigades of civil defense, composed by volunteers and municipal personnel, prepared themselves with basic equipment, manual pumps, buckets of water, hooks to demolish structures in flames. At the 08, the first markers fell over the designated district. From the air, the crews observed how small luminous points defined the perimeter. In matter of minutes, the first principal wave initiated the systematic release of incendiaries following the planned rectangular pattern. Between the 015 and the 030, hundreds of sub-munitions penetrated roofs and walls. In dwellings of wood, the fires expanded almost of immediate. The napalm slid by tatamis and beams, catching with speed. The residents tried to extinguish the first focuses with water, but the simultaneous quantity of fires overwhelmed any coordinated response. At the 040, new formations entered in the corridor of attack. From low altitude, the crews saw already multiple columns of smoke rising. The visibility, illuminated by the initial fires, facilitated the identification of zones yet intact. The bombs continued falling with regularity. Testimonies collected subsequently by Japanese authorities describe scenes of increasing chaos. Some survivors related how the air began to move with unusual violence, feeding the flames that advanced from house to house. Entire families tried to escape towards open spaces or towards the Sumida River. Others searched for refuge in anti-aerial ditches which soon remained saturated. Between the 1:0 and the 2:0 of the morning, the accumulation of focuses generated a phenomenon different to that of isolated fires. The massive heat provoked upward currents that sucked air towards the center of the affected zone. The wind, that in surface could feel itself like intense gusts, pushed incandescent embers through streets and roofs. The fire brigades remained incapacitated. The water pipes broke under the heat and the pressure. Emergency vehicles could not advance through routes blocked by debris and multitudes. In certain sectors, the temperature reached levels that prevented approaching at less than several meters of the structures in flames. Towards the 2:30, wide blocks were wrapped in continuous fire. Some accounts describe people that tried to cross open avenues only to find themselves with gusts of hot air that knocked down those who ran. In the banks of the Sumida, thousands crowded searching for protection. Many threw themselves to the water, others remained trapped by the pressure of the multitude. From the air, the pilots informed of turbulences provoked by upward thermal currents. The surface of the city appeared a uniform luminous extension. The pattern of attack had achieved its objective, to create a compact strip of interconnected fires. At dawn, the magnitude of the damage was visible. Entire sectors of the east of Tokyo were reduced to smoking debris. The preliminary balance indicated that dozens of thousands of buildings had been destroyed. The posterior estimations situated the figure of deaths in a range superior to the 100,000 people, although the counts varied due to the difficulty of immediate identification. From the US military point of view, the operative reports highlighted the efficacy of the method. The losses of B-29 were relatively low in comparison with the magnitude of the damage inflicted. The command concluded that the combination of low altitude, massive concentration of incendiaries, and withdrawal of defensive armament had produced results superior to those obtained in previous months. Posterior strategic analyses underlined that the devastated area included thousands of small workshops that formed part of the Japanese industrial network. The destruction did not limit itself to installations identified individually, but that affected the productive structure integrated in the urban fabric. While the fires extinguished slowly in the following days, Tokyo presented a transformed landscape. Entire streets had disappeared, dozens of thousands of people remained without home. The local authorities tried to reorganize basic services in middle of a devastation without precedents within the aerial campaign until that moment. In the Marianas, the operation was registered as a replicable model. The experience of the 9 and 10 of March incorporated itself to the planning of posterior missions against other Japanese cities, consolidating a pattern that had demonstrated its capacity to generate urban destruction in large scale through a single concentrated incursion. The archipelago under attack, cities and ports collapse. From March of 1940 the U.S. aerial campaign adopted in a systematic way the destruction of urban areas as central axis of its offensive against Japan. With the new focus already in March, the command of the 21 Bomber Command expanded the list of strategic objectives more beyond of the capital. The following large objective was Osaka. The city not only was a relevant commercial center, but an industrial node with factories of steel, heavy machinery, chemical products and a wide network of subcontractor workshops. Its urban configuration converted it into an adequate objective for the application of the method already employed in Tokyo. In the attacks launched against Osaka during March and April, the formations of B-29 replicated the scheme already tested: nocturnal approximation, descent to medium-low altitude, concentrated release of incendiaries, and withdrawal without prolonging the permanence over the objective. The waves did not search for a concrete building, but to saturate entire zones. In question of hours, wide surfaces remained wrapped in flames. The posterior reports indicated that industrial and residential sectors remained integrated in a same perimeter of destruction. The Japanese defenses responded with anti-aerial artillery, but the lack of fuel and the limited availability of interceptors reduced their efficacy. The U.S. losses were reduced in proportion to the damage caused. In the internal analysis of the aerial command, Osaka confirmed that the method could apply itself of repeated form with consistent results. Kobe was the following large objective. Port city and center of naval construction, it harbored shipyards, warehouses and factories linked to the maritime production. Also there, the dividing line between industrial installations and dwellings was tenuous. The incendiary attacks generated fires that propagated rapidly between light structures. Wide areas of the port and worker neighborhoods remained razed. Japanese testimonies collected after the war describe columns of smoke visible at kilometers of distance and streets transformed into corridors of fire. The fire brigades tried to create fire breaks demolishing dwellings, but the intensity of the focuses exceeded the available resources. The urban system, already tensioned by months of scarcity, could not respond in a coordinated way. Nagoya, key center of the Japanese aeronautical industry, was hit with the same logic. There were found plants related with the production of engines and aviation components. However, good part of the manufacture depended of small family workshops integrated in densely populated districts. The incendiary bombing affected both principal installations and that dispersed network of production. The repetition of the pattern in several cities consolidated a cumulative phenomenon. It did not treat solely of destroying buildings, but of disarticulating the framework that connected manufacture, transport and distribution. Each attack reduced the capacity of recovery of the general economic system. The Japanese authorities tried to redistribute production towards zones less affected, but the constant aerial pressure hindered any stable reorganization. Parallel to the incendiary campaign was intensified a different operation that operated over the maritime infrastructure. The U.S. Air Force began to sow mines in ports, straits and internal coastal routes. This campaign, designed to block the Japanese maritime traffic, affected not only large commercial ports, but secondary accesses utilized for regional transport. The aerial mines were released with precision over channels and port entry mouths. Their effect was immediate. Merchant ships began to avoid usual routes for fear of explosions. The transport of coal from Hokkaido towards the industrial zones of the south became irregular. The movement of rice and other foods towards urban centers suffered increasing interruptions. The combination of U.S. submarine activity and aerial mining reduced drastically the capacity of the Japanese merchant navy. Ships that survived the aerial attack faced now constant risks in coastal waters. The internal logistical network began to fragment a visible form. The exchange between agricultural and industrial regions slowed down until critical levels. Reports intercepted by U.S. intelligence, including traffic deciphered through the MAGIC system, indicated increasing difficulties in the assignment of resources. Internal communications reflected problems of fuel, delays in transport, and tension in the distribution of food. These signals reinforced in Washington the perception that the combined pressure was producing structural effects. In the affected cities, the civil impact was profound. Millions of people remained without dwelling after successive waves of attacks. Improvised refuges and displacements towards rural zones became frequent. Saturated hospitals treated wounded by burns, fractures, and structural collapses. The health infrastructure, damaged or insufficient, barely could respond. The official rations descended progressively. The railway system, limited by lack of fuel and spare parts, operated with constant delays. Factories that had not been directly destroyed faced scarcity of inputs and cuts in electrical supply. The urban economy functioned with continuous interruptions. In the U.S. command centers, the analyses posterior to each incursion were detailed. Aerial photographs before and after allowed measuring raised surface and density of destruction. Percentages of dwellings and workshops eliminated were estimated. These data incorporated themselves to wider strategic evaluations. The evolution of the strategic thinking was progressive but clear. Initially, the incendiary bombing had been conceived as tactical adaptation. With each new city devastated, it passed to convert into the central axis of the aerial offensive. The doctrine prioritized now urban saturation in front of surgical selection. The planners observed that the destruction of complete neighborhoods affected simultaneously production, worker housing, and local transport networks. The objective was not solely to weaken specific military installations, but to erode the system in its whole. The integration between industry and residential fabric converted the entire city into a functional unit within the war effort. At measure that advanced, the spring and the summer of 1945 approached, more medium cities were added to the lists of objectives. Each operation followed similar parameters: massive concentration of aircraft, reduction of defensive weight to maximize incendiary load, and nocturnal planning to minimize losses. The cumulative result was a visible transformation of the Japanese urban landscape. Extensive sectors of Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya remained reduced to ruins. Partially unusable ports and mined maritime routes limited the capacity of redistributing resources. The aerial and maritime pressure operated in a coordinated way over the same economic system. In Washington and in the command of the Pacific, the conclusions were operative, not rhetorical. The figures of tons released, square miles destroyed, and maritime traffic paralyzed incorporated themselves to periodic reports. Each evaluation reinforced the idea that the combination of urban fire and logistical asphyxia was reducing the Japanese capacity of sustaining the war. The campaign already did not perceive itself as a series of isolated episodes, but as a continuous sequence that expanded the perimeter of destruction. Each city added increased the pressure over a weakened system, while the aerial offensive entered in a phase every time more intense. However, other strategic decisions were taking form and would alter soon the course of the war. Manhattan Project, the weapon that changed the balance. The origin of the program that culminated in the nuclear weapon remounts to 1938, when the German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann identified the phenomenon of nuclear fission in the uranium. Lisa Meitner and Otto Frisch interpreted correctly the process. Upon dividing the nucleus, it released an extraordinary quantity of energy. The military implication did not delay in appearing in the mind of European physicists who had fled from the Nazism. In August of 1939, Leo Szilard drafted a letter signed by Albert Einstein directed to the President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The document warned that Germany could try to develop a bomb based in the reaction in chain of the uranium. The letter did not affirm that such weapon existed, but that the physics demonstrated its possibility. Roosevelt authorized preliminary studies under the Advisory Committee on Uranium. During the first years, the work was dispersed and of limited scale. However, after the entry of United States in the war in December of 1941 and the evaluation of intelligence over German investigations, the program acquired strategic priority. In September of 1942, the Army assumed the formal control. The General Leslie R. Groves was designated to direct the project, which received the administrative name Manhattan Engineer District. Groves reorganized the structure with military criteria. He selected as scientific director J. Robert Oppenheimer, who established the Central Laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. There concentrated a team that included physicists like Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, Edward Teller, and Richard Feynman. The challenge consisted in transforming theoretical equations into an operative device capable of releasing energy of controlled way until the moment of detonation. Two technical routes developed in parallel. The first centered in the uranium-235. The principal problem was that the natural uranium contains barely around the 0.7% of that fissionable isotope. To obtain useful quantities, it was necessary to separate it from the uranium-238. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, giant installations were built that employed three distinct methods: gaseous diffusion, electromagnetic separation, and thermal diffusion. The Y-12 complex utilized enormous electromagnetic calutrons. The K-20 and 5, a plant of gaseous diffusion of more than half a kilometer of length, required electrical consumption comparable to that of a medium city. The second path was the plutonium-239. This element was not found in natural state in usable quantities and should be produced artificially in nuclear reactors. In Hanford, Washington, the first industrial reactors of the world were built. Bars of uranium were irradiated and then processed chemically to extract plutonium. The plant required installations of remote separation due to the intense radioactivity of the material. The design of the weapon based in uranium adopted the system type cannon. In this model, a subcritical mass of U-230 and 5 was propelled through conventional explosives towards another mass, forming instantaneously a supercritical configuration that initiated the reaction in chain. The calculations indicated that this mechanism had high probability of functioning without necessity of previous test. The plutonium presented additional difficulties. The impurities generated in the reactor made unviable the method-type cannon. The scientists developed then the system of implosion. In place of joining two masses, a sphere of plutonium was compressed through explosive loads arranged in precise geometry. The objective was to achieve a symmetric compression that increased the density until reaching the supercritical state. For that were designed electrical detonators synchronized with precision of microseconds. The total cost of the project exceeded the $20 billion of the epoch. More than 120 and 5.0 people participated in distinct levels without knowing the final purpose. The installations were distributed deliberately in isolated zones under strict measures of security and compartmentalization of information. In July of 1945, the design of implosion was ready for test. The essay received the code name Trinity. The device was placed in the top of a tower of steel of some 30 meters in the desert of Alamogordo, New Mexico. At the 5:29:40 and 5 of the morning of the 16th of July, the detonation produced an explosion whose performance was estimated in approximately 20 kilotons of TNT. The ball of fire ascended rapidly and generated a cloud in form of mushroom visible at great distance. Instruments registered data over pressure, temperature, and radiation. The success confirmed that the design of implosion functioned according to the predicted. For Groves and Oppenheimer, the technical uncertainty remained overcome. In April of 1945, after the death of Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman assumed the presidency without detailed knowledge of the program. He was informed formally shortly after his inauguration. During the Potsdam Conference in July, he received a ciphered message communicating that the test had been satisfactory. From that moment, the new weapon ceased to be a theoretical possibility and converted into an available military option. Before Trinity, the government had constituted the called Interim Committee. This organ included the Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, James F. Burns, Vannevar Bush, Carl Compton, and other officials and advisers. Also was consulted a scientific panel headed by Oppenheimer. The purpose was to evaluate how to employ the weapon from the political and strategic point of view. In the deliberations arose the question of a possible demonstration. Some scientists raised to detonate the device in an uninhabited area or before international observers to warn Japan without attacking a city. The report, known as Frank Report, expressed reservations over the direct use without previous notice. However, other participants argued that a demonstration could not achieve decisive effect. Existed the risk that the device failed, or that Japan did not react before an explosion in isolated zone. Also, it was considered that the strategic impact should be immediate and clear. The interim committee concluded that the weapon should be employed against a Japanese objective as soon as possible and without specific warning over its nature. The recommendation established that the target should possess significant military or industrial importance and not have been previously devastated to be able to evaluate the real effect of the weapon. A preliminary list of possible objectives was elaborated: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Kyoto. Hiroshima stood out for its urban size, presence of military installations, and relative absence of previous bombings. Kyoto was initially included by its industrial value, but Stimson intervened personally to withdraw it from the list due to its cultural and historical importance. While these decisions developed, the 509th Composite Group was assigned a specialized unit. Under the command of the Colonel Paul Tibbets, it received specific training in launch of bombs of great weight and in strict security procedures. The B-29 destined to the mission were modified to transport the new device. In July of 1945, components of the weapon began to move from United States towards the island of Tinian in the Pacific. The final assembly would be realized in the theater of operations under technical supervision. The operative orders established that the attack would execute itself in as much as the meteorological conditions allowed it. In that point, the process initiated with a letter in 1939 had evolved towards a formal decision of military employment. The program had integrated advanced scientific research, industrial infrastructure at national scale, and political deliberations at the highest level. After the technical confirmation in the desert of New Mexico and the recommendations of the interim committee, the new weapon was ready to be utilized within the strategy of war in course. Hiroshima 8/15. Detonation and shockwave. In the night of the 5 to the 6 of August of 1945, in the aerial base of Northfield, Tinian, the operation was presented as a special mission within the 509th Composite Group. The Colonel, Paul W. Tibbets, gathered the crew assigned to the B-29 number 80 and 2. The objective was confirmed: Hiroshima. The meteorological forecasts indicated clear sky. The plane chosen had been baptized that same night with the name Enola Gay. At the 2:45 of the morning, the bomber initiated the race of takeoff. It carried a load superior to the 4 tons in its central bay. Besides the Enola Gay, took off other B-29, the Great Artiste, in charge of scientific instrumentation, and the Necessary Evil, destined to photography and observation. Before, 3 meteorological apparatuses had departed towards distinct possible objectives to confirm visibility. The crew of the Enola Gay included the Major Thomas Ferraby as bombardier, the Captain William Parsons as armament officer, and the Second Lieutenant Maurice Jepson as technical assistant. Parsons had decided not to complete the total arming on ground. The final procedure would be realized in flight to reduce risks. During the journey over the Pacific, the plane maintained cruise altitude while it directed towards Iwo Jima as point of reunion. There they met with the other apparatuses of the mission. Confirmed the position and the favorable meteorological state over Hiroshima, the group advanced towards the Japanese archipelago. In full flight, Parsons and Jepson descended to the bomb bay. They introduced the loads of gunpowder necessary to activate the internal mechanism of the device. The process was realized with manual tools and under conditions of controlled stability. The system remained armed approximately 30 minutes before the launch. Hiroshima was headquarters of the 2nd General Army Japanese and point of logistical concentration. Its urban layout was formed by 6 rivers that divided the city into multiple flat sectors, easily identifiable from great height. At difference of other cities already bombed intensely, Hiroshima had suffered limited attacks until that moment. Shortly before the 8:00 of the morning, the Enola Gay began the final approximation. The altitude stabilized in approximately 31.0 feet, something more than 9.400 meters. The sky was clear. There was no significant aerial opposition. The anti-aerial artillery realized some dispersed shots without precision. At the 8:15 and 17 seconds, Ferriby released the device after identifying the assigned reference point, the Ioi Bridge, with distinctive form visible from the air. Immediately after, Tibbets executed a turn of almost 160 degrees to move away at maximum power. The bomb descended during some 43 seconds. At an approximate height of 1,900 feet, some 580 meters over the ground, the internal mechanism initiated the reaction in chain. The explosion released energy equivalent to some 15 kilotons of TNT, according to posterior estimations. In a fraction of a second, a ball of fire of several hundreds of meters of diameter formed. The temperature in the center reached several millions of degrees. The thermal radiation expanded with extreme intensity. Exposed surfaces in direct line absorbed enough energy to carbonize materials. Shadows of objects and people remained printed on walls and pavements due to the instantaneous thermal contrast. In a radio of approximately 1 kilometer, light structures remained vaporized or crushed. The wave of shock followed immediately the initial light. The front of pressure advanced at supersonic speed in the first phases. Buildings of wood collapsed almost by complete in wide zones. Constructions of reinforced concrete suffered loss of windows, doors, and severe structural damages. The pressure broke electrical lines, knocked down poles, and projected debris at great distance. From the Enola Gay, the crew observed the blue-white flash followed by the expansion of an upward column. The mushroom began to rise rapidly, reaching several kilometers of height in minutes. Turbulences shook the plane due to the secondary expansive wave. On ground, the sequence was immediate. People exposed to the open air suffered severe burns in discovered skin. Light clothes reflected part of the radiation, while dark fabrics absorbed greater thermal energy. In offices and factories, the pressure destroyed interiors and trapped occupants under beams and collapsed walls. Fires began to arise in multiple points almost at the same time. The combination of initial heat and inflammable structures generated independent focuses that then connected. In districts close to the epicenter, the destruction was almost total. The communications remained interrupted. The telephone lines ceased to function. The general headquarters of the army in the city suffered severe damages. Local authorities tried to organize emergency response, but the magnitude exceeded the available capacity. During the first hours, thousands of people moved towards the outskirts searching for water and assistance. Hospitals resulted damaged and medical personnel saw itself overwhelmed. Many official buildings remained unusable. The initial estimations of victims were imprecise due to the lack of immediate records. In Tinian, the Enola Gay landed after completing the mission. A codified message confirming the success was transmitted. Instruments of the great artiste had registered data of pressure and radiation that would be analyzed subsequently. The aerial command informed Washington that the objective had been reached according to the planned. The President Harry S. Truman, who returned from the Potsdam Conference on board of the USS Augusta, received the formal notification. That same day, a public comunicado was prepared announcing the employment of a bomb of atomic energy against a Japanese objective. The text signaled that the weapon represented the result of years of research and industrial production. In Tokyo, the initial reaction was of bewilderment. The communications with Hiroshima interrupted of abrupt form. A plane sent for reconnaissance confirmed that great part of the city had been destroyed. Preliminary reports described an explosion of unknown intensity until then. The Japanese High Command requested technical analyses. Japanese physicists, among them Yoshio Nishina, were sent to investigate. The first report suggested that it could treat of a weapon based in nuclear principles, although the confirmation required additional evaluation. While the smoke continued rising over Hiroshima, the Japanese authorities tried to establish the real reach of the damage. The information arrived fragmented and with delay. The city that hours before had functioned as regional administrative and military center presented now extensive devastated areas. In United States, the result was registered as the first operative use of a nuclear weapon. The operation integrated itself in the strategic sequence in course. In Japan, the material impact and the nature of the weapon began to be understood gradually by scientists and military responsibles. During the rest of the day, 6 of August, the scenario in Hiroshima remained marked by persistent fires, collapse of infrastructure, and massive displacements of survivors towards zones less affected. The magnitude of the event exceeded any precedent within the aerial campaign until that moment. Nagasaki and the Soviet entry, the double blow. The 7th of August of 1940, a day after of the destruction of Hiroshima, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War met in Tokyo. The information received from the city was fragmentary. Military reports confirmed an extensive devastation and an explosion of unknown characteristics. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Togo Shigenori, sustained that the nature of the weapon indicated a new stage in the war and that Japan should consider seriously the acceptance of the Declaration of Potsdam. The council was divided in two blocks. By one side, Togo and the Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro defended to explore a diplomatic exit that preserved the imperial institution. By other, the Minister of War, General Anami Korechika, together with the Chief of the Staff of the Army, General Umezu Yoshijiro, and the Admiral Toyoda Soemu, sustained that Japan still could inflict significant losses if the Allies tried to invade the archipelago. The structure of the council demanded unanimity to adopt a formal decision. The division paralyzed any immediate resolution. Some military officers questioned even that United States disposed of more than one artifact similar to the employed in Hiroshima. While the debate continued in Tokyo, in Tinian were finalized the preparations of a second mission. The device assigned was distinct to the utilized days before. It incorporated plutonium and a mechanism of implosion. The designated bomber was the B-29 Boxcar, under the command of the Major Charles W. Sweeney. The armament officer was the Commander Frederick Ashworth. The morning of the 9th of August at the 3:47, the Boxcar took off from Northfield. Accompanied it the Great Artiste and the Big Stink, this last in charge of registering the explosion photographically. The established primary objective was the industrial city of Kokura, where was located an important arsenal. The plan demanded direct visual launch. Upon approximating to Kokura, the crew found dense cloudiness and smoke originating from recent conventional bombings over nearby cities. Sweeney realized 3 passes over the objective trying to identify the designated point. Each attempt increased the consumption of fuel. The time passed, and the anti-aerial defense began to react. With the level of fuel diminishing and without clear visual confirmation, Sweeney decided to direct to the secondary objective, Nagasaki. The city was an industrial center with Mitsubishi shipyards, armament factories and metallurgical plants. At difference of Kokura, it presented irregular topography, with hills that delimited the urban valley. Upon arriving over Nagasaki, the cloud coverage continued being significant. However, a momentary opening allowed to identify partially the industrial area of the valley of Urakami. At the 11:02 of the morning, the device was released. The detonation produced itself approximately at 500 meters over the ground. The estimated performance was close to 20 and 1 kilotons. The explosion generated a ball of fire followed by an expansive wave that traversed the valley. The mountainous configuration limited the lateral extension compared with flatter cities, although industrial sectors and residential neighborhoods close to the epicenter remained devastated. While this second operation developed, another event altered of decisive form the strategic scenario. In the midnight of the 8th to the 9th of August, the Soviet Union declared formally the war to Japan. At the 1:00 of the morning, Soviet forces crossed the border of Manchuria. The Red Army initiated a massive offensive against the Kwantung Army. The Soviet offensive was executed in multiple simultaneous axes. Mechanized divisions advanced with speed, supported by artillery and aviation. The Kwantung Army, that had been one of the most powerful formations of Japan in previous years, found itself weakened by transfers of units towards the archipelago and by logistical deficiencies. In few days, the Soviet forces penetrated deeply in Manchurian territory, overcoming Japanese defensive lines. The speed of advance surprised the high command in Tokyo. The possibility of utilizing Moscow as diplomatic mediator remained annulled of immediate way. In the morning of the 9th of August, while the news of the Soviet offensive arrived to the Japanese capital, the Supreme Council returned to meet. The combined information of a second nuclear detonation and the Soviet entry in war created a scenario of simultaneous pressure from the air and from the continent. Togo argued that the strategic situation had transformed by complete. With the Soviet Union as belligerent, Japan faced the possibility of invasion from the north, besides the Allied threat in the south. Anami maintained his initial position, sustaining that the army could resist in national territory and negotiate more favorable conditions after a decisive battle. The council returned to remain divided in a tie 3-3. Before the impossibility of reaching unanimity, Suzuki requested the convocation of an imperial conference, an expanded meeting in presence of the Emperor Hirohito. In the morning of the 10th of August, in the underground refuge of the imperial palace, was celebrated the conference. The ministers exposed their positions before the monarch. After listening to the arguments, Hirohito expressed his opinion of that Japan should accept the Declaration of Potsdam with the condition of that the position of the emperor was not altered. The imperial intervention broke the decision-making blockade. A message was sent through diplomatic channels indicating the disposition to accept the terms with that specific condition. However, within sectors of the army persisted resistance to the idea of putting end to the conflict in those terms. In those days, Tokyo faced fragmentary information over the real reach of the Soviet offensive and the magnitude of the destruction in Nagasaki. The temporal coincidence of both events produced a cumulative impact in the Japanese strategic evaluation. The structure of defense conceived to face an Allied invasion saw itself now threatened from multiple directions. Between the 9 and the 10 of August, the deliberations in the Japanese leadership turned around how to respond before a military situation that had changed of accelerated way in matter of hours. The double impact of a new nuclear explosion and the Soviet offensive in Manchuria modified the political and military calculation of the High Command. The final decision yet required formalization and communication. But in that moment, the internal equilibrium that had sustained the Japanese resistance began to incline under the combined pressure of the events developed in those days of August, from the imperial message to the atomic era. In the night of the 14th to the 15th of August of 1945, when the decision of accepting the Allied terms already had been adopted in the imperial level, a group of officers of the army tried to prevent that the announcement arrived to the population. The plan consisted in occupying the imperial palace, isolating the civil authorities, and destroying the recording of the message of the emperor. The conspirators believed that without the official transmission, they could force the continuation of the war. The attempt developed with rapid movements within the palace complex. Support was searched from superior commands, but many generals refused to back the action. The lack of coordination and of decisive adhesion prevented to consolidate the control. The commander of the Army of the East rejected to join the uprising. Without wide backing, the operation disintegrated in few hours. Some involved committed suicide after the failure. At the noon of the 15th of August, the voice of the Emperor Hirohito was transmitted by radio to all the country. It was the first time that the population listened directly to the monarch. The speech, formulated in formal and careful language, announced that Japan accepted the terms of the Declaration of Potsdam. It did not utilize the word surrender, but left clear that the war arrived to its end. The decision was presented as an act destined to preserve the nation and avoid additional sufferings. In many cities, the popular reaction was of bewilderment. Some citizens cried, others remained in silence. During years, the propaganda had promoted the resistance until the last resource. The sudden acceptance of the defeat demanded an immediate psychological readjustment. The armed forces received orders of ceasing the combat. In distinct garrisons of the empire, the commanders transmitted instructions to stop operations and conserve the order. In the following weeks began the arrival of Allied forces to the archipelago. The General Douglas MacArthur assumed the position of Supreme Commander of the Allied powers. The occupation was organized under a structure that maintained formally the Japanese government in functioning, but subordinated to external directives. The Japanese armed forces were dissolved. Millions of soldiers returned from the foreign or were demobilized within the country. Structural deep reforms were initiated. The constitution was revised under Allied supervision. The new text redefined the sovereignty as emanation of the people and transformed the emperor into symbol of the state without direct political power. The article that renounced to the use of the war as sovereign right marked a decisive institutional change. The agrarian reform redistributed lands of large owners to tenant peasants. Partial dissolution of industrial conglomerates that had concentrated economic power in previous years was promoted. Unions were legalized and civil liberties were expanded. Officials associated to the military regime were removed from their positions in processes of administrative purging. In the judicial scope, war crimes trials were organized against civil and military leaders. Some were condemned and executed, others received prison sentences. The criminal responsibility centered in figures identified as principal responsibles of strategic and political decisions during the conflict. Among the population affected by the nuclear detonations arose a group that later would be known as Hibakusha. These people faced prolonged medical consequences related with the exposure to radiation. In the first years of the occupation, the public information over radiological effects was limited by censorship controls. With the time, began to organize themselves associations of survivors that claimed recognition and support. While Japan initiated its political and social transformation, the impact of the use of atomic weapons extended to the international plane. In United States, the project that had produced the bomb converted into foundation of a new strategic stage. Organisms in charge of administering and developing nuclear technology in times of peace were established, including the Atomic Energy Commission. The initial U.S. monopoly over nuclear armament lasted few years. In 1949, the Soviet Union realized its first successful test. The international equilibrium passed from a unipolar situation to a bilateral competition. Subsequently, United Kingdom, France and China developed their own arsenals. Decades later, India and Pakistan effected declared nuclear essays. Israel maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity regarding its capacity. North Korea carried out tests in the 21st century. The accumulation of arsenals gave origin to the concept of nuclear deterrence. The central idea sustained that the possession of reciprocal destructive capacity would prevent the effective use of these weapons by making unacceptable any first attack. During the Cold War, this logic expressed itself in doctrines like the assured mutual destruction. However, the stability depended on alert systems, human decisions, and complex technical controls. Incidents of false alarm and international crises demonstrated the potential fragility of the equilibrium. The proliferation added new actors with own doctrines and distinct regional contexts. For Japan, the end of the war signified a progressive integration in an international system in which the nuclear weapons occupied a central place in the strategy of the large powers. The country adopted an official policy of not possessing, not producing, and not allowing the introduction of nuclear weapons in its territory, while it remained under the U.S. security umbrella. The strategic legacy of August of 1945 projected itself more beyond the immediate surrender. The existence of nuclear armament altered the global military planning, the diplomacy, and the perception of the risk in posterior conflicts. Since then, the policy of international security has been conditioned by the presence of arsenals capable of producing devastation in scales without precedence.